I will just give a minute for folks to come in to our webinar room with a warm welcome for joining us again for season 5 of Diggin' In. We'll just give ourselves a little bit of time for folks to pop into our meeting space, and I will begin some introductions. For those of you who are joining us, thank you so much. We're just going to give it another few seconds and I'll begin our webinar presentation. Okay, let's get ourselves started. I want to welcome everybody back to season 5 of Diggin' In. We are so pleased that we are entering this 5th season. It feels like a milestone. We have 40 episodes already in this fantastic production, our pandemic pivot, brought to you by the Massachusetts Archaeological Society and the Robert S. Peabody Institute for Archaeology. My name is Suanna Crowley, and I am a past president of Mass Archaeology and also a current trustee. I am the colleague of Lindsay Randall, the curator of education and art and outreach at the RS Peabody Institute, and she is your usual host for these programs. Unfortunately, Lindsay is encountering some technical difficulties with logging in and connecting with us today. So I'm receiving frantic texts, and I hope that she will be able to join us shortly. In the meantime, I am your backup host and MC for our program today. So just by way of introduction, Diggin' In, if you are new to our program, is a series of live presentations with scholars from around the country. And as I said, co-sponsored by the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology and the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. We like to begin with a land acknowledgement for the land on which the Peabody Institute and its school, the Phillips Academy, are situated on. And I'll read that to you now. Phillips Academy occupies the land of the Pennacook and Pawtucket peoples and the lands of contemporary Abenaki, Massachusetts, Wampanoag, Wabanaki, Pokanoket, and Nipmuc nations. We honor all Indigenous peoples who are here now, have been here for time immemorial, and will be here in the future. We acknowledge Indigenous genocide and the continued oppression of Native peoples, voices, cultures, and spiritualities. We understand how education has been used by settler institutions in the attempted erasure of Indigenous peoples. We commit to interrogating the histories of that and our complicity in colonization, centering Native voices and communities, and dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism at Phillips Academy. So, just by way of a little bit of housekeeping, we want to let you know that Diggin' In is a series that is hosted every other Wednesday at 1:30 Eastern Standard Time. We have 10 episodes to run through December for these presentations. A schedule of events is available through your registration and also at the peabody.andover.edu website and at the Massachusetts Archaeological Society Facebook page at Mass Archaeology. If you're enjoying our programming, and we certainly hope that you are, we invite you to consider expanding your impact by becoming a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. We will be better able to bring you outstanding programming through the support of viewers and members like you. Now, we're going to turn to the introductions of our guests today. We are very excited to welcome Danielle Cathcart and Dr. Suzanne Spencer-Wood. Danielle R. Cathcart is the Laboratory and Collections Manager at RGA Incorporated, with over 15 years of experience in academic, nonprofit, and cultural resources management settings. Ms. Cathcart currently serves on the Executive Board of the Archaeological Society of New Jersey and a member of the ACRA Collections Management and Curations Committee. Suzanne M. Spencer-Wood is a professor at Oakland University in Michigan and served for many years as a research associate at the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard. She organized the first 2 conference symposia on feminist gender research in historical archaeology in 1989, followed by several gender symposia and papers and conferences. Spencer-Wood's publications on feminist theory include numerous articles, as well as book chapters in Quandaries and Quests and Women in Antiquity, Theoretical Approaches to Gender and Archaeology. We are going to invite our speakers to start, but during and at the conclusion of our talk, viewers, our attendees today will be able to submit questions directly to me through the Q&A function on the webinar button on your Zoom screen. We will hopefully have time for our guests to answer as many questions as they can, with the understanding we might not get to them all. But I will certainly hope that Lindsay will join me in emceeing some of the wonderful questions that we anticipate today. So without further ado, we want to welcome Danielle and Suzanne, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Suanna. So let me just get the screen sharing started. That coming through?
It looks wonderful.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for attending. Oops. There we go. 71 Joy Street is located in downtown Boston on the north slope of Beacon Hill and is situated less than a quarter mile northwest of the Massachusetts State House. It was home to several free Black families in the mid to late 19th century, as well as working class white tenants in the early 20th century. In the summer of 2006, current homeowner Michael Terranova invited then city archaeologist Ellen Berkland and Boston University professor Dr. Mary Beaudry to conduct an archaeological salvage excavation at the property following his discovery of the brick-lined privy beneath a concrete floor during renovations to the attached rear shed. This effort yielded over 7,000 artifacts, with nearly 90% originating from the privy. The recovered artifacts include numerous items pertaining to the health, hygiene, personal adornment, and domestic life of the multi-ethnic inhabitants between 1840 and circa 1930. Many of the objects speak to the public and private dimensions of urban life in Beacon Hill, the heart of Boston's free Black community until the turn of the 20th century. The ability of the residents to deploy consumer goods in performances of gender, class, and racial identities is visible in patterns observed in the artifact assemblage. Strategies for maintaining a sanitary environment and healthy lifestyle, embedded in prevailing scientific theories of disease transmission, are also considered key elements in the performance of refined gentility. Such performances were instrumental in the community-wide struggle for equality led by resident activists, including individuals associated with 71 Joy Street. Although a small number of sites on Beacon Hill have been subject to archaeological surveys, 71 Joy Street stands out as the only Black-owned private residence to be professionally excavated in the neighborhood, with deposits representing more than 50 years of continuous African-American ownership. Our focus today centers on the personal and activities-related assemblage totaling 201 artifacts from the privy and adjacent builder's trench features in an effort to answer three main questions. What does the consumer behavior of the 71 Joy Street inhabitants reveal about the construction of a private and public self-identity beyond the immediate satisfaction of vital needs or temporary desires? How is this process situated within the socio-historical environment of mid to late 19th century Boston, and more specifically the African-American enclave of Beacon Hill? And to what extent did the residents materialize aspirations of working class respectability or middle class refined gentility through gender performances? We'll begin with a brief historic context describing the growth of the African-American community on the north slope of Beacon Hill and the site-specific occupation of 71 Joy Street by a series of working class families, followed by a presentation of the archaeological and primary source data pertaining to household sanitation practices. And we'll close my presentation by discussing the many and varied identity performances observable in the artifact assemblage. The original topography of Beacon Hill consisted of three landforms referred to as Cotton, Century, and West or Mount Vernon Hills, collectively known as the Tri-Mountain, which was reduced to the current configuration during a large-scale land-making project in the early 19th century. Settlement occurred in two main areas beginning in the 1760s, centered on Belknap, now Joy Street, near the corner of what is now Phillips and West Cedar Streets. The poorly drained soils, indirect sunlight, and difficult terrain kept the nation community isolated until the last decade of the 18th century, when the completion of the State House in 1798 prompted housing developments for the city's merchant and political elite along the south slope facing the Boston Common. In the early 19th century, the North Slope continued to develop in an intricate and organic fashion that subdivided small backlots into inexpensive housing, predominantly for free African-American tenants, laborers, and professionals. By 1860, the area housed more than half of the city's Black residents. James and Lois Horton note that, quote, "This residential concentration distorted the perception of those who passed through the community, making it seem larger than it actually was," end quote. In reality, African Americans only constituted between 1% and 3% of the total metropolitan population between 1830 and 1860. As the Civil War loomed, the North Slope became a refuge for fugitive slaves, entrepreneurs, and skilled laborers who came together to form the heart of Boston's abolitionist community. Many residents demonstrated their commitment to the community by investing in property used as venues for social activism and suitable housing for friends and family. More so than proximity to one another, African Americans on Beacon Hill coalesced around the African Meeting House as the central node of community activity. Built in 1806 at 46 Joy Street, the Meeting House was among the first Black-owned institutions in the neighborhood and is one of the oldest surviving African American churches in the country. This institution served as the focal point for education, political activism, worship, social gatherings for the duration of the community's presence on Beacon Hill. By the turn of the 20th century, socioeconomic factors influenced a demographic shift in favor of newly arrived European migrants. While few structures from the African American community on the North Slope escaped the redevelopment boom of the mid-20th century, the cluster of buildings on Joy Street that includes the study area survived as some of the earliest extant structures affiliated with the former Black community on the Hill. The first documented African American ownership of the property occurred on September 25, 1822, when John Harris, a Black laborer from the North End, purchased 14 Belknap from merchant Samuel Austin Jr. for $825, which was a value consistent with a wooden building. 3 months later, Harris sold an undivided moiety, or equal half part of the property, to Harriet Roberts, a single woman and seamstress, for $413, who later conveyed her half to her father, Robert Roberts, in 1824. Harris bequeathed his remaining portion to John Harris Roberts, his namesake, and the 8-year-old son of Robert Roberts upon his death in 1827. J.H. Roberts, listed as Mariner in the deed transfer, sold his portion of 14 Belknap to his father on November 18, 1841. Thereby, Robert Roberts consolidated full ownership of 71 Joy Street. Among the many known individuals with affiliations to 71, Robert Roberts is one of the most notable. He's a celebrated figure in African American history as the author of the House Servants Directory, one of the first books written by an African American published by a commercial press in 1827. While he never resided at 71 Joy Street, his presence is visible in the extant brick dwelling he commissioned and in the privy feature uncovered during the 2006 survey. The building contract recorded in the margins of the Suffolk Registry of Deeds is remarkable both for its detail and specific mention of a privy to be dug in, quote, "a back shed," end quote. The extant brick dwelling is a testament to Roberts's commitment to create a lasting, comfortable structure with appropriate amenities for his family and tenants. Such amenities included mortared and plastered walls, timber floors, an entryway skylight, sash windows in both the main house and cellar, and all doors and sashes finished with locks and fastenings, all completed for $900. Between 1841 and 1878, at least 28 individuals, including 4 families, resided at 71 through 73 Joy Street, employed in commonly held positions in the service, maritime, and commerce trades. Many of these individuals are listed in the Boston City directories as residing at the property for less than a year. However, others more commonly spent between 1 and 3 years as tenants. Notable exceptions include the George family, comprised of dressmaker Matilda, her mother Judah, née Butler, and father Thomas, a mariner, who spent at least 7 years at the house, and the Freeman family, brothers Peter Lou, Barzillai, Osmore, and Stephen, whose occupancy spanned a quarter century between circa 1841 and 1866. The Freemans were descendants of Barzillai Lou, a Revolutionary War veteran who participated in the Battle of Bunker Hill. Shortly before his death in 1861, at the approximate age of 86, Robert Roberts transferred 71 Joy Street to long-term tenant Peter Lou Freeman on September 6, 1859. Freeman continued to reside on the property until 1866, when he sold the house to clothing dealer John P. Coburn. And like Roberts, Coburn appears to have used 71 Joy Street as a rental property, maintaining his primary residence on Coburn Court, 2 blocks east of Joy Street. Coburn's tenants, numbering at least 14, appear more transient than during Freeman's tenure and were comprised mostly of single men. Only 2 families, the Marshes and Crockendales, are represented in the city directories. However, more might be enumerated in the census record. The period of African-American ownership ended after 56 years when Wendell T. Coburn, adopted son and heir to John P.'s estate, sold 71 Joy Street to William J. and Fanny Rounds of Cambridge in 1878. Information obtained from the archaeological deposits, architectural data, and primary source material reveals how sanitation was conceived, practiced, and internalized and displayed by the multi-ethnic residents of 71 Joy Street. The time period represented by the artifact assemblage also coincides with the transition from miasmatic notions of disease transmission to the scientifically grounded germ theory, and provides a unique opportunity to observe how the popular discourse on hygiene and sanitation impacted both municipal and individual behaviors. In providing for the proper disposal of household wastes, city residents would have also been subjected to governmental regulations and taken cues from infrastructure improvement projects grounded in notions of environmental sanitation and germ theory. Therefore, patterns of consumer behavior and structural modifications to homes like 71 Joy Street can also be interpreted within the context of citywide waste management practices. Salvage excavation of the privy and shed interior was completed with assistance from student volunteers from BU and UMass Boston. A site grid divided the 8.5 by 17.5 foot shed into 10 1x1 meter units lettered A through J. An uneven layer of overburden was removed from the shed interior to level out the ground surface, and 6 units were excavated according to observed stratigraphic levels. No artifacts were retained from units A, B, F, or G, and excavation did not go beyond removal of the overburden. Units D and E, in the top left of the screen, encompass the privy feature, and a builder's trench was discovered in units I and J running along the privy south wall. The rectangular privy vault was constructed with a single course of brick and measured 4.6 by 5.6 feet with a total shaft depth of 5.5 feet. A 1 foot thick layer of rubble and household refuse covered the shaft surface, which provided support for the concrete floor removed by the property owner prior to the commencement of fieldwork. The privy contained 9 stratigraphic contexts. However, artifact distribution and cross-mending analysis revealed it was largely filled in 3 episodes, likely corresponding to changes in occupancy and renovation events. The privy appears to have been in use immediately after construction in 1841 and continued for nearly a century when the household completed the transition to indoor plumbing. Diagnostic artifacts recovered from the overburden deposit suggest a capping date circa 1930. In contrast to the neighboring privy on the Meeting House property in use during the first half of the 19th century, the lifespan of the 71 Joy Street privy was considerably longer. It was also built of sturdier material with a brick paved floor to prevent groundwater contamination and sunk deeper into the ground than the wood-lined shaft at 46 Joy Street, which rested on footing stones set on clay subsoil. Both privies, however, were subjected to repeated cleanings, as suggested by the presence of only a thin layer of night soil observed at 46 Joy Street, and the total absence of parasite ova in the single soil sample collected from the base of 71 Joy Street, likely due to persistent drainage. The 3 deposition episodes designated overburden/fill 1, fill 2, and fill 3 contained a total of 791 diagnostic artifacts spanning the 17th through mid-20th centuries. Of the 196 artifacts with beginning manufacturing dates coinciding with the African-American owner/occupancy periods, over 2/3 were distributed between fill 2, 3, and the builder's trench. Artifacts dating between 1600 and the 1870s also account for greater than 70% of the diagnostic material within those contexts. Late 19th and 20th century artifacts deposited by the white occupants consist mainly of wire nails, but also include fragments of English porcelain, white granite, Victorian majolica, mold-blown and machine-made glass bottles, and an ebony toothbrush. A total of 201 personal and activities-related artifacts represent just 3% of the total artifacts. Clothing fasteners, jewelry, personal accoutrement items such as a pocket knife and brass pocket watch components, and grooming/health-related objects total 51% of the subassemblage. Terracotta flower pots and elaborately molded flower urns, tobacco pipes, alcohol bottles, children's toys, and slate pencils represent the activities-related component. The overburden/fill one deposit is largely composed of clothing-related artifacts, although indulgence objects like wine or liquor bottle pieces, pipe fragments, as well as the ceramic gardening vessels are almost equally abundant. Health/grooming items consisting of medicine bottles, a porcelain soap dish, and plastic pin are among the least numerous fill components. Most of the diagnostic artifacts within this deposit span the occupancy period of both the white and black residents, such as the nearly complete U.S. Marine Hospital Service bottle, manufactured between 1870 and circa 1905. One seaman mentioned before, Thomas George, resided at Joy Street until his death circa 1847. However, the bottle most likely originated from an unknown white or black occupant who may have been treated as a civilian for cholera or yellow fever. Fills 2 and 3 and the Builder's Trench contained a total of 104 personal and activities-related artifacts, including 25 objects diagnostic to the African-American occupancy period. Clothing fasteners, jewelry, and personal accoutrement account for 50% of the artifact types in these contexts. Noteworthy items include a wood-handled pocket knife, 2 pocket watch components, a white metal hat pin, and a jet black faceted glass bead from fill 2, as well as a gilt leaf brooch with red coral accents from fill 3. The brooch is reminiscent of the Romantic period of the Victorian era jewelry styles, dating from circa 1837 to 1860. The quantity and variety of clothing fasteners, as well as a copper alloy thimble fragment from fill 2, may reflect not only the clothing worn by the residents, but also the occupational byproducts of dressmakers Matilda George and Mrs. George H. Marsh, or clothes dealer/cleaner Jessie Harrell. Although they comprise less than 12% of the total subassemblage, the grooming/health-related objects are a salient category for understanding how the 71 Joy Street residents attended to their bodily needs in preparation for public interactions both within and outside their social networks. These objects, concentrated in fills 2 and 3, consist of a whiteware ointment/toothpaste pot, medicine bottles, homeopathic vials, perfume bottles, and an engraved ebony toothbrush handle. Fill 3 contained a complete Ayers sarsaparilla bottle, patent medicine bottle, available between 1848 and the mid-1880s, which was likely utilized by one of the African-American tenants, perhaps hoping to relieve any number of ailments the concoction was purported to cure, including fatigue, anemia, gout, arthritis, and even psoriasis. The homeopathic medicine vials in fill 2 and 3 exhibit manufacturing attributes characteristic of the early to late 19th century and were meant to contain concoctions of, quote, ethical medicines, possibly obtained from one of the known practitioners living on Joy Street, such as Doctors Peter Jessamy or Rebecca Lee Crumpler. One rim fragment from fill 2 is covered in a gray putty-like substance, tapered to a point, suggesting that the vial contained medicine meant to be dispensed by the drop. 2 perfume bottles also date to the mid to late 19th century and are representative of an effort to not only combat permeating odors believed to transmit disease, but an acknowledgement on the part of the African-American tenants of what Del Upton characterizes as the sensory and performative aspects of urban living. Both bottles are intact and were deposited in fill 3. One is a small cylindrical sampler manufactured by Xavier Bazin between circa 1853 and 1884, and the other is a panel bottle diagnostic to 1845 through the late 1880s from the Boston-based perfume and fancy goods proprietor Preston and Merrill. In addition to the perfumes, Philadelphia manufacturer and importer Xavier Bazin advertised shaving cream, soap, and cosmetics like Eau Lustral, hair restoratives, and Egyptian hair dye, warranted to produce a beautiful black color in 10 minutes. 2 grooming/health items are definitively associated with the white tenants. These are a nearly whole Sloan's nerve and bone liniment bottle from a Boston-based proprietor, which was first advertised in 1890 as an external treatment, and the toothbrush handled engraved warranted Japan. The toothbrush is a somewhat surprising discovery, given that even by the 20th century, when technological advances made this product widely available, only approximately 20% of the American population used them on a regular basis. I'm getting ahead of myself. Comparison of the proportional makeup of personal and activities-related items within the 3 fill deposits reveals several differences in the consumption habits between the black and white tenants of 71 Joyce Street. The most visible distinction is the near total absence of indulgence items in the deeper or earlier deposits, which also show a dramatic increase in the grooming/health related commodities compared to the overburden/fill 1 deposit. The Black residents seem to have placed a greater emphasis on the purchase of medicines, cosmetics, and clothing items, in contrast to the white occupants, who appear to have invested more resources in leisure/recreational or supplement and nutritional activities such as gardening, smoking, and drinking. It's also possible the Black tenants simply discarded indulgence items elsewhere or consumed them in a group settings outside the home. The individual artifacts, however, show both groups relied on name brand patent medicines and a shared concern for personal hygiene in the toothbrush affiliated with a white resident and the perfume bottles and ointment/toothpaste pot utilized by members of the African American households. In addition to the archaeological record, a site-specific record of sanitation practices and infrastructure development at 71 Joyce Street exists in several types of primary source data. These records contextualize the perseverance of the privy as integral to the waste management practices of the 71 Joyce Street inhabitants into the 20th century, as suggested by the archaeological data, and reveal how old technologies were used to bridge the gap between the adoption of modern conveniences. The 1840-41 building contract executed between Robert Roberts and the Boston-based firm Pratt & McKinney is likely referring to the privy in the direction to, quote, build necessary vault with brick and cement 4 inches thick. However, specific mention of a privy is the last item addressed in the terms. The archaeological discovery that the privy was brick-lined even to the floor is a satisfying instance of concurrence with the documentary record. Absent from the contract, however, is the observed drainage channel and sewer pipe installed at the base, either during or after initial construction. The drainage channel implies a desire to extend the longevity of the privy as the primary sanitation utility while conforming with local ordinances to protect groundwater, which allowed private homes to discharge liquid waste into the city sewer. Subsequent building improvements documented in permit applications demonstrate the owners responded to expanded access and new sanitation technologies and completed the transition away from the privy to a water closet system by 1921, and then finally to indoor plumbing sometime before 1949. This time period generally conforms with the archaeologically ascertained date in the late 1920s or early 30s that the privy was sealed. This implies 71 Joyce Street lagged behind in making the switch to flush toilets by at least a decade compared to other households in the city. Tax records show that household water consumption rates remained relatively steady between 1888 and 1920, suggesting that the use of one or more water closets that may or may not have drained into the privy before reaching the municipal sewers before the owners could make the switch to indoor plumbing. The archaeological evidence from 71 Joyce Street points to repeated efforts on the part of the residents to maintain a standard of personal well-being that included a concern for physical health and the social intelligibility of their appearance in public. Performances of health, hygiene, and the use of fashionable dress/household furnishings achieved through commodities consumption conveyed respectability, refinement, and gentility. The consumer goods deployed in these performances seem to confirm Paul Mullins's assertion that, quote, like virtually all Americans, many African Americans saw their bodies as consumer sites that could be maintained and even improved by mass-produced commodities, end quote. The consumer goods also confirm his statement that, quote, many African Americans embraced genteel materialism that demonstrated their suitability to civil and consumer citizenship, end quote. An important lens for interpreting the performative consumption of the health and hygiene artifacts is Robert Roberts's directory, with its emphasis on cleanliness of person and attire of those in the service trades. The views Roberts expressed in his directory speak to the value he placed on respectability. Although he never resided at 71 Joy Street, Roberts was active in abolitionist circles for many years, and he surely visited his brother-in-law and early resident, the Reverend Hosea Easton. He also likely returned to collect rents from the tenants. He also remained a fixture in the community until his death, circa 1861. While the directory was a groundbreaking publication both for the author's status among the white gentry and within the abolitionist community at large, the book was also an inarguable commercial success that was deeply influential to generations of Black domestics, caterers, restaurateurs, and cooks. Among the known residents of 71 Joy Street noted in Boston City directories between 1840 and 1878, there are waiters, porters, dressmakers, a shoemaker, and a clothing dealer, some of whom may have taken cues for physical and social comportment from the directory. On earning the high esteem of both colleagues and social superiors, Roberts advises to let your character be remarkable for industry and moderation, your manners and deportment for modesty and humility, and your dress distinguished for simplicity, frugality, and neatness. He acknowledges the communal goal and Black masculine ideal of freedom in stating that quiet, steady perseverance is the only sure spring which you can safely depend upon to infallibly promote your progress on the road to independence. It is important to note, however, that the directory was written and reviewed under the gaze of his prominent white employers, so Roberts's rhetoric was necessarily restrained and inherently non-threatening to a white audience unwilling to conceive of Black laborers as anything other than subservient. Nonetheless, while the majority of Roberts' directory is overtly concerned with the pursuit of cleanliness, both in one's person and their environs, it covertly links the performance of Black masculinity with a respectable, composed identity and appearance, a message that held wide appeal among those with middle-class/genteel aspirations. We see signals of aspirations to respectability and gentility through masculine displays of the collar studs, cufflinks, pocket watch, and pocket knife. These could denote wealth, status, and the identity of a gentleman who practiced the ideology of self-regulation through time discipline. The pocket knife is notable for its multiple uses, from shucking oysters or cleaning fish caught in the nearby waters, to being used as a weapon in self-defense and the preservation of bodily respectability against violent racism. A tool of bodily defense also conforms to patriarchal notions of manhood, which entailed the protection of one's home and family. Beyond the material culture and assertion of freedom, citizenship, and humanity enshrined in the ideals of Black masculinity is recorded in the willingness of several residents to regularly pay the poll tax, including Thomas George in 1841 and brothers Peterloo, Barzillai, and Osmore at $1.50 each in 1859. Peterloo, in fact, shouldered the expense to vote for at least 7 years between 1837 and 1859 on his earnings as a waiter or a tender. Thomas George's occupation as a seaman, a masculinized profession, and the freeman family history of military service exemplified notions of Black manhood as the pursuit of self-sufficiency, racial uplift, respectability, and the freedom, both in the communal goal of abolition and in the bodily sense. Finally, a sense of feminine, middle-class domestic respectability, refinement, and gentility is signaled with such objects as ceramic tableware and decorative bric-a-brac, and also through the use of hat pins and adornment items like the jet glass the jet glass faceted bead and the gilt leaf and red coral brooch. A mid-19th century Gothic style plate from Phil III, flower pots, elaborately molded flower urns, and a Staffordshire hen on nest figurine in Phil II appeared to acknowledge the role of women in the 19th century as the moral guardians of their communities and home. Teresa Bolger describes an alternate model of Black womanhood in which artifacts evoking motherhood and domesticity were at once readable by middle-class white women, but also, quote, fundamental to strategies for achieving equality and personhood, and that the true woman, held up by Black media as a respectable woman, was a respectable woman who was an emotional center of the family, but also an important and active member of her community, end quote. Expressions of Black gender ideals, therefore, necessarily entailed a public and private component. The Black men and women at 71 Joy Street clearly expressed not only fluency in dominant social norms regarding household consumption, marketing, and appropriate dress, but also a tacit subversion of social and political institutions which sought to deny their humanity and legitimacy as full citizens. Evidence from 71 Joy Street demonstrates that privies figured prominently in urban household waste disposal habits into the 20th century. The principles of environmental sanitation, effects of municipal infrastructure expansion, and regulations on the behaviors of private citizens were clearly at work on the site. The relative sturdiness and longevity of the privy itself reveals a dedicated interest on the part of the residents and homeowners in maintaining a healthy standard of living. The construction materials, size, enclosed location in a shed, and connection to the municipal sewer system also demonstrate an adherence to municipal codes grounded in theories of environmental sanitation and disease transmission. Analysis of the personal and activities-related artifacts across the 3 deposition episodes show diverse strategies for achieving a healthy, hygienic, and respectable lifestyle. From these few objects, an image of daily life for these individuals starts to emerge. By approaching the material culture of health, hygiene, and display as symbols of the interplay between the public and private consumption of commodities, subtle details of reflexive identities of respectability, refinement, and gentility come into focus. At 71 Joy Street, we see how the different occupants through time mobilized consumer goods to ornament, medicate, and present their bodies and homes as respectable, genteel, and refined. And for the Black men and women and children on the site, they were forced to define themselves against a backdrop of racial exclusion and oppression in the self-made community of Beacon Hill's North Slope, a community that endures through the items they used and the places they lived. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Great, Danielle. Can you unshare your screen and then
Absolutely.
I'll do a little more here. That was
I hope
really...
I wasn't reading too fast. I was trying not to take up too much time.
No, it was great. Actually, absolutely great. So let me just start here at the beginning here. Okay, so I just have a few more interpretations of some of the artifacts that I found since, we gave our paper at the SHA, and I want to just start by mentioning that the jet glass bead is actually something that was made very popular by Queen Victoria. So it has a reference of the sovereign of the home and so forth. It has, in other words, it has symbolic meanings that are really interesting here. Another thing, the hen nest, which is, the broken bottom here that you can see on the right from the site. And then I found these 2 examples of about the right size mini hen nest trinket boxes that are about the right size, and you can see the way that the nest was made here is more similar to the one on the left there than the one on the right, and also in terms of color. But what I found was really interesting is the hen on nest figurine really symbolizes the sacredness of motherhood. And this comes from a biblical quote from Matthew's 23:37-9, which Jesus said when he was in Jerusalem. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. And this is one of the few places in scripture actually where God has given female characteristics. And so it sanctifies motherhood very clearly. And in 1659, Anne Bradstreet wrote a famous poem in reference to her children, which used this metaphor of her as the mother hen painstakingly raising the young birds that then fly away to school and to marriage and so forth. It's a long poem, but it's something that these folks would have been familiar with, I think. It's very possible. Then there's also some more etiquette manuals that I think are really interesting here because they particularly had pictures of women's proper dress and so forth for respectability. And Black women were really tasked with racial uplift and representing community respectability because women suffered the most racist and sexist discrimination and abuse which was justified by the stereotype of Black women's supposedly inherently promiscuity. And this was so the argument was that if you can uplift Black women, it uplifts the whole race, because they were the most denigrated. And respectability was indicated, as Danielle mentioned, by cleanliness and fashionable clothes. So this on the right is a drawing from Elias Wood's 1899, The Negro in Etiquette, a Novelty. And this subtitle, a novelty, which is, kind of swarmy and makes me wonder if in fact he was white writing this, because that novelty idea is a real dig. It's negative. So, but anyway, in this picture, what you've got, or this drawing, is on the right, an unladylike sort of failed housewife who wears a country neck scarf and headscarf and apron. And one of the you were not supposed to show, even if you were a domestic servant, respectable domestic servants were not supposed to show that they were cleaning. And so wearing an apron and so forth is a negative in itself. And the fact that she leaned forward with her hand on her hip, and the dirty house indicated in the title of the drawing here, "Come in if you can get in for the dirt," indicates that, and basically this is a reference to, in 1899, these manuals about correct dress for African-American women were directed at the immigrants coming from the South, from the rural South, who were not considered to dress appropriately by the Northern African Americans, who were more urbane in their dress and so forth. So in the left, what you've got in this drawing is a lady who's demurely dressed in this clean white, simple becoming gown, which is what the quote from this one article. And this article by B.E. Bradford in 1909, called Woman, in the Colored American Magazine, said that you should not dress in gaudily decorated silks and coarse, vulgar ornaments. So this was against the African American dressing, with fancy kinds of things, although she still has a hat that's fairly fancy, I think, here. And one of the other things I noticed about this drawing that I think is really interesting is that the lady on the left, although she has a dark color, her features, as you can see, her nose and so forth, are actually white. So that's kind of interesting here. Then in 1918, the Detroit Urban League Dress Well pamphlet promoted bourgeois female respectability. So on the left, you had disorder and dirt and licentiousness and careless appearance, all these things. What I think is really interesting is, in this linkage of characteristics, licentiousness or promiscuity is linked to dirt and disorder and careless appearance. And so here you have a woman who's with her legs spread and the slippers, wearing a house coat and a boudoir cap. The boudoir cap is a symbol of the domestic servant. And so again, it's and one of the things that they said in this 1918 pamphlet was that women should not wear boudoir caps in public, and men should not wear working clothes in public. So in terms of respectable things to wear, this fits right in with the watch that a man would wear and so forth. And of course, there's trash-filled stairs here. And the other picture here on the right has, and I hope you can see that behind our pictures here. Maybe we can get rid of us entirely. The woman on the right has, let me just get rid of us here. Yeah. The woman on the right here is demurely dressed, knees together, button-up shoes, and well-dressed hair. And and clean steps, very important to symbolize the cleanliness of the home, which was important also in terms of representing respectability in the community. So women's clubs also warned against wearing flashy clothes or too much finery, signaling profligacy and immorality, which I think is really interesting. And this made me actually wonder if the leaf brooch, which is in the center here, the gilt leaf brooch with the coral beads, and those coral, by the way, was considered good luck. So you have the teethers from earlier colonial sites with coral and coral teethers with bells, and that was for good luck for the infant. And this would have been good luck too. But I wondered when after reading the respectability ideas, if in fact this might have been discarded purposely as an example of something that was considered too flashy to wear anymore. And so that was a thought I had about that. Also, the frozen Charlotte doll here would have been something about teaching domesticity and respectable domestic motherhood with the baby doll. And the hat pin on the top right here was something that could also be used for self-defense against men who assaulted unescorted women on public streets, who were considered public women, and particularly in the case of African-American women, would have been assumed to be innately promiscuous and available, so there was a lot of assault on public streets, especially at night, and African-American women coming home from work late in the day or in the night would have suffered from that. Finally, I found this interesting quote here from Forrester B. Washington, who was the founder in 1916 of the Detroit Urban League, which was had an exemplary plan for assimilating Southern migrants to Detroit, and was used as a model across the country. And he was also the founder of the Race Men's Dresswell Club in Detroit. He asked, why is segregation increasing? He said, chiefly on account of the loud, noisy, almost nude women in calico he didn't say calico, but they were Mother Hubbards standing around in the public thoroughfares. So I found this picture of Mother Hubbard from 1890. These were the known as the improved Mother Hubbards because of the circular collar at the top. The earlier ones had square collars, but this would have been more likely because you're talking about 1916. And you can see, so he's talking about almost nude, and I looked at, this is covering the whole body. So what did he mean by almost nude? It doesn't make any sense, right? And initially I thought, well, they weren't wearing corsets maybe under here, and they were jiggling when they moved or something. But I also just found this Dodge City Times 1883 article that said that Mother Hubbards were all the rage in Topeka, Kansas, and were ruined in Junction City when, quote, a couple of nymphs paraded with this rigging, wholly suspending business. And the city marshal interrupted the show by marching the girls off to the police judge under the idea they were out in their nightgowns. So this, I think, sheds light on the almost nude comment because of the illegality of wearing nightgowns in public, which I was not aware of. but probably was more widespread than just in Junction City out west. In fact, I would consider probably more likely the further east you go as a problem. So I thought these were interesting sorts of additional interpretations for some of the artifacts that were found that are interesting to sort of bring to light and particularly highlight Black women's role, which was really considered most important in protecting, promoting, projecting respectability on the idea that dressing respectably, having a clean house and so forth, especially dressing respectably in job interviews, would get women work beyond domestic service, which they really didn't favor because there was a lot of sexual assault going on in domestic service. And of course, the pay is better in other occupations. So the idea was that dressing respectably would help protect Black women from assault on the job, although this didn't entirely work. There was a real problem when they were hired as elevator operators, and so they ended up alone with men in the elevator. So that didn't work out too well. But this was the idea that, and what I think is most interesting is that there's more strict rules for women in terms of dress code than there is for men, I think. And the quote by Washington shows that women's representation of respectability of the Black community was not, was being enforced by the men, and it wasn't just, a sort of voluntary optional thing that women could do. They had to do this in terms of representing the respectability of the community, or they would get blowback from the African-American men for not correctly representing respectability. And I expect probably this could also happen for the men if they wore working clothes in public, as was suggested in that same booklet and so forth. So anyway, those are my sort of additional interpretations. I think fit very well with the whole, with Danielle's presentation too. And I just noticed there's this like marble in the right lower hand corner here too, which also indicates probably boys playing in the area. So you have both boys and girls artifacts here, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's nice. I think oftentimes the toys are the only indication of children on a site. It's unless you can catch them in a census record. So this is telling, in the records I looked through, I didn't really see any indication of children, but they could be there if someone else was to look. But yeah, like the artifacts tell us that children are absolutely there, and they were there, into the 20th century. I had, there's baby food bottles that were from the 1920s in the upper layers, which I didn't discuss, but.
Yeah, so I mean, that makes sense that there would be kids there. I mean, generally there are kids at domestic sites.
There's generally kids everywhere, right?
That's true. In
back then, in the 19th century, they're like, they're little adults. They're just in training to be little adults. So
yeah, exactly.
There was no childhood.
Yeah. So they tend to be there. Exactly. In most places, I, in fact, excavated a general store where there were paper dolls pasted on the wall from like the turn of around 1890, 1900, something like that. And there was a sandbox outside, so they're playing around the store, which people don't, archaeologists don't usually think about kids at a store.
Yeah.
That's where they were, very clearly. So, so I think they're very clearly here too, although you may not have them in the census record, as you said.
Well, Excellent. Thank you, ladies, for this. And I'm so sorry that, my town's electricity went out.
It's good to see you.
The one good thing is when this does happen, it's just our town. We're not part of the rest of the North Shore. So they only have to figure out us, and we're on the same grid as the police and fire department. So
Priorities.
it makes it much shorter, at least. So if people have questions for Danielle and Suzanne, you can put them either into the chat or the Q&A function, and I'll read it to them. To kind of get us started, and I do apologize for not being here for most of this, but I do have a question, Danielle. What is your favorite artifact from this assemblage? I don't know if you went over it already.
I didn't. That's a great question.
Oh, sorry.
No, I did not.
What's your second favorite then?
I did not go over it already.
Oh, okay. I thought you had. Sorry.
It's a great question because I do have a quick answer, and it's the brooch. And I will tell you, it's because, so when they were excavating the material and then they processed it, it was student volunteers. And so I came along later and I kind of recatalogued everything. And I was like looking at some of the metal objects. So like the pocket knife was completely unrecognizable. I did some conservation treatment to reveal what it was. And the brooch was just this mass of dirt and corrosion. And I like scraped it away and I started seeing the little red bits in it, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's a brooch, so that was just a really fun discovery even after the digging had finished.
Wow, that's
it doesn't just stop right in the field.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you keep finding new things. Like I just found the biblical reference to the hen and the nest, and those other conduct manuals when I was researching historical, suggesting more historical markers in Detroit. I came across those and realized they were relevant, for this as well. Although one of them was particularly, pamphlet of the Detroit Urban League. I'm sure there were similar things elsewhere. And the other one, the general etiquette manual, that's I think a national one. So,
I mean, and I really appreciate, your perspective on some of these artifacts, because I just remember, kind of going through and recataloging, and I was a little bit stymied by the nest, when I came across it. I was like, what is this? And then over time, people finally helped me figure out what it was. And you've given more interpretation to it beyond just, the little bit that we have remaining.
Yeah, well, it's a lot more, it turns out. Yeah, I mean, I didn't realize that, but I just started looking at hen and nest, to try to figure out what it meant. And first I came across Anne Bradstreet's poem.
Yeah.
And then just recently, actually, I was talking to my sister about this, and she mentioned to me that there was a reference in the Bible to the hen on the nest. So that's, that's how
this motif seems to come up. So when I was reading through Teresa Bolger's thesis on the Nantucket Boston Higginbotham house, that's a repeating motif on the transferware pattern. There's a lot of bird and nest imagery. So it's kind of, it's either, an extremely popular piece of imagery, but it seems to have meaning for people.
Well, yeah, I think it is because it basically symbolizes the sanctity of motherhood. And so it's very elevating for women, I would imagine, to have one of these, and just sort of comforting in a general kind of a way. I would think emotionally, if you think about it, I mean, motherhood's a lot of work. And so, so to have some symbol of appreciation and symbolizing the sanctity of motherhood would be, I think, emotionally, helpful and gratifying, for all the work you're doing.
So we do have a question that just came in. Are the etiquette manuals being written by African Americans? And what are the social history documents available for Boston and these residents?
Okay, so the Roberts one, as Danielle said, he was, a famous African American resident of 71 Joy Street. The ones that I presented, the Urban League of Detroit, Forrester Washington was African American, yes. And that the Dresswell Club was composed of race men who were interested in uplifting the race by dressing respectably in Detroit, and thereby gaining better employment was a lot of the reason for the respectability push in dressing well for both men and women in Detroit, because they were hugely discriminated against. There was no employment with all the car factories, you know, until way after, after the First World War and so forth. So that's that. I know the other one I think is probably a white person, although I don't really know. But the reason that I think that is because the title, The Negro in Etiquette, quote, and the subtitle, A Novelty. That's really, that's a real dig at African Americans, right? And so I think this is unlikely to have been an African American. And in addition, if you look at the drawing, things keep moving on me here when I don't want them to. But if you look at the drawing, the fact that the respectable lady on the left has, as when you look at, you can't see her features very well, but her nose sure is small, she basically has a white profile, not an African American profile. And so that also made me think, and this I mean, it could be an African American writing this, but if it is, then what you've got here, I think psychologically, is identifying with the oppressor, which is a very common thing, and so that could be an explanation if you have an African American writing this. But I think it's, more likely to be white, but I don't really know.
There's also one of the residents who I mentioned briefly, Hosea Easton. The Eastons and the Roberts family have deep connections. Easton was a reverend, and he actually wrote a book, a treatise in 1837. And in there are some passages referring to comportment, specifically aimed at women. So I left it out. That was in the longer version of this already long
Everyone's
version.
trying to dictate to the women.
But in terms of going back to their social histories, the authors that come to mind off the top of my head are the James and Lois Horton's books. They've written several books about Boston and the African American community in Boston that are fantastic. I'm pretty sure I referenced them in the references slide. So you can look those up. They're
excellent. Well, thank you, Danielle and Suzanne. This was awesome. Again, I can't wait to go rewatch it. It will be up on our YouTube page. I will share the link with everyone. So thank you to our speakers, and thank you to our viewers for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you at our next lecture, which will be Wednesday, August 17th, when we are joined by Dr. Liz Iberola, and who will be speaking about the archaeology of Fort Mose in Florida. And that has been recently in the news for doing both underwater and terrestrial digs simultaneously during the spring and summer. And before I start choking, I'm gonna have some water. And again, we rely on the support of viewers like you, so consider supporting our outreach by becoming a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. This was awesome. So
thank you so much, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lindsay. And
thank you, Suanna, as well. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.